He married an older woman for money. But what happened next will shock you. Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm bringing you a story about ambition, choices, and the courage to stay true to oneself. Meet Jake, a young man who dreams of escaping poverty, only to discover that wealth comes with a price. Join me as we follow his journey through trials, loyalty, and an unexpected final test. In a quiet American town, life moved at its own steady pace. Days bled into each other, marked by the familiar sounds of tractors, the hum of family cars, and neighbors greeting each other over picket fences. Jake, a young man known for his sharp wit and charming smile, found himself restless amidst the predictability. He was admired by many in town for his confidence and warmth. Yet those who looked closer saw the hints of frustration lurking behind his easy smile. Jake's family struggled with finances, and while his friends were getting ahead in life, Jake felt trapped, watching them pass him by. Every evening, Jake would wander down the town's main street, taking in the sights, people laughing at cafes, kids racing bicycles down the lanes, and locals discussing the latest news outside the market. The glow of prosperity was tantalizingly close, yet it felt a world away from him. He wanted something more, something that felt out of reach. Despite his aspirations, Jake felt he'd been dealt a hand that kept him tethered to the life he knew, one without the freedom or means he dreamed of. It was during one of these evening walks that Jake first heard about Ms. Evelyn. She was a well-known figure in the area, respected and perhaps a little feared, older than Jake by a few decades. She owned several farms, properties, and businesses across town. People whispered about her mysterious, quiet nature and her substantial wealth, while her age and experience set her apart from the rest of the town. Her air of authority was unmistakable. Yet, there was something intriguing in the rumor that reached Jake that evening. Ms. Evelyn was looking for a husband. Jake stopped in his tracks as he heard two elderly women gossiping nearby. Imagine Ms. Evelyn, with all that wealth, looking for someone young and handsome. One of them chuckled. "I wouldn't mind the money, but marriage to a woman like her? Unthinkable." Their voices trailed off. But Jake's mind raced. If Ms. Evelyn truly wanted a younger husband, then maybe, just maybe, she might consider someone like him. He could hardly believe his luck. The thought of a life without financial struggle was like a beacon in the fog. It was too tempting to ignore, even if the idea seemed far-fetched. When Jake shared his thoughts with his friend Tommy, he was met with laughter. "You're seriously considering this, Jake? Marry Ms. Evelyn for her money?" Tommy couldn't contain his amusement, but Jake's response was earnest. "It's not just the money, Tommy. It's the chance to change my life, to finally have a say in how I live. I'd do whatever it takes to have that." Over the next few days, Jake couldn't shake the idea. He thought about Ms. Evelyn, her life of power and independence. The image of her grand estate filled his mind, a world so unlike his own, and he pictured himself there, living a life without the shackles of financial worry. Soon, Jake found himself preparing for an encounter that could change everything. On a brisk morning, he donned his best clothes, his only suit, pressed and cleaned with meticulous care. He walked the winding path that led to Ms. Evelyn's estate, his heartbeat quickening with each step. The house stood on a hill, surrounded by manicured gardens and hedges, exuding an aura of quiet strength that matched its owner. Standing before the large wooden doors, he took a deep breath and knocked. Moments later, the door opened, and there stood Ms. Evelyn herself. She wore a silk scarf over her silver hair, her attire simple yet dignified. Her gaze was sharp, taking in Jake with a knowing look, as if she'd already guessed the purpose of his visit. "What brings a young man like you to my door?" she asked, her voice steady and commanding. Jake swallowed, mustering his most sincere smile. "Ms. Evelyn," he began, his voice a little unsteady, "I've heard of your search for a companion, a partner. I believe I could be the one you're looking for." A faint smile crossed her face, but her eyes remained keen, unyielding. "And why would a young man such as yourself wish to marry an older woman like me?" she asked, her tone challenging. Caught off guard, Jake stumbled for a moment. He had hoped for an easy path, perhaps some quick charm that might impress her. But her question was pointed, meant to unearth his true motives. Gathering his thoughts, he replied, "It's not just about wealth. Ms. Evelyn, I see in you a person of strength and wisdom. Together, we could build something even greater." Ms. Evelyn observed him for a long time, her gaze weighing him. She finally gave a nod, her expression unreadable. "Very well, Jake, I'll consider your proposal. But understand this, marrying me is not as simple as it seems. If you want a life with me, you'll need to prove yourself." Jake's heart raced with excitement. He had hoped she would be open to the idea, but he hadn't anticipated a test. Still, he nodded eagerly. "I'll do whatever it takes." With a slight smile, Ms. Evelyn said, "We'll see if you mean that. Jake, for now, consider this the beginning of your trial." Jake left Ms. Evelyn's grand estate that evening, his mind spinning with excitement and anticipation. As he made his way down the winding path back to town, he could already feel a glimmer of the future he'd dreamed about, a life of freedom and financial security. But Ms. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. "If you want a life with me, you'll need to prove yourself." He wondered what sort of test she had in store for him. Was it a simple task to measure his dedication? Or did she intend to challenge him in a way he hadn't anticipated? The following morning, Jake woke with the first rays of dawn. His nerves simmered with both hope and anxiety, determined to show his worth. He arrived at Ms. Evelyn's estate as the early light cast a golden hue over her meticulously kept gardens. He was greeted at the door by Ms. Evelyn's housekeeper, Mrs. May, a sharp-eyed, elderly woman who seemed to size him up in a single glance. With a nod, she gestured for him to follow. Ms. Evelyn awaited him in her sitting room, elegantly dressed and composed as ever. She wasted no time with pleasantries. "Jake," she began, "you say you want to share a life with me. Yet a life of comfort comes with certain demands. I need a partner who not only speaks of strength but shows it. You must be willing to get your hands dirty." Jake nodded, eager to show his sincerity. "Tell me what to do, Ms. Evelyn, and I'll prove myself." A glimmer of amusement flickered in her eyes. She pointed to a large, woven basket resting on a nearby table. "Your first task is a simple one," she said. "Take this basket of food to my workers at the farm on the edge of town. They are hard at work and will need it by midday." Jake almost sighed with relief. It was a straightforward task. Hardly a test, he thought, but he kept his expression neutral. "Of course," he said, lifting the heavy basket. "Consider it done." As he made his way to the farm, however, he quickly realized it wasn't as effortless as he'd imagined. The sun was high, beating down on him as he trekked across dusty paths. By the time he reached the farm, his shirt was drenched, and his muscles ached from carrying the basket. He had underestimated the journey and the weight of the food Ms. Evelyn had prepared for her workers. The farm sprawled before him, much larger than he'd imagined, with rows of crops stretching far across the land. Workers moved rhythmically, their hands swift and practiced as they tended to the fields. As Jake approached, the chatter of the workers quieted, and they turned to look at him curiously. An older man, tall and weathered from years of labor, stepped forward. His name was Sam, a longtime worker who had served on Ms. Evelyn's farm longer than Jake had been alive. "You must be the young man Ms. Evelyn's been talking about," Sam said, wiping his brow with a weathered hand. Jake smiled, setting down the basket. "Yes, she sent me with food for the workers," he replied, trying to sound confident. Sam raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "Ah, so she's testing you," he remarked, though there was no malice in his tone. "Well, if carrying a basket was all it took to impress Ms. Evelyn, I'd be a rich man by now." Jake chuckled, realizing he might be in for more than he'd bargained for. "What do you mean?" he asked, a little nervously. Just then, one of the younger workers called out, pointing toward the far end of the field. There was a commotion. The irrigation system had burst, and water was beginning to pool, threatening to flood the crops. Sam sighed heavily, shaking his head. "This happens every so often," he said. "We'll need all hands on deck to fix it before the crops are ruined." Jake saw his chance to prove himself. Without waiting for an invitation, He rolled up his sleeves, waded into the muddy field, and joined the workers in the repair. The work was grueling, the midday sun blazing overhead, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on, determined to show Ms. Evelyn and himself that he wasn't afraid of hard work. Hours passed, and Jake's muscles burned with exhaustion. But finally, the system was repaired, and the water flowed evenly once again. As they finished, Sam clapped him on the back. "Not bad, kid," he said with a nod of approval. "Maybe you're not just here for the money after all." Jake smiled, feeling a surprising sense of pride. The labor had been tougher than he'd expected, but he had completed it without complaint. The thought of his future with Ms. Evelyn's fortune kept him going. Yet he also felt a glimmer of satisfaction that he hadn't anticipated. Perhaps, he thought, Ms. Evelyn was trying to show him that hard work could bring its own rewards. When he returned to the estate, sweaty and exhausted, Ms. Evelyn awaited him. She looked him over, her expression unreadable, and nodded approvingly. "You did well today, Jake," she said. "But understand, this was only the beginning. A life of wealth requires more than just ambition. It requires strength and resilience." As he left her presence that evening, Jake felt a shiver of excitement and apprehension. He had passed the first test, but he knew more awaited him. Would he be strong enough to face them all? And he wondered what other parts of himself would be tested along the way. The next morning, as the first light crept over the town, Jake felt the soreness from the previous day's work deep in his muscles. The effort of working in the sun had left him exhausted, but the memory of Ms. Evelyn's approving nod filled him with a strange sense of accomplishment. Still, he reminded himself why he was there. His goal was to secure a future without the worries that had plagued him all his life. By mid-morning, Jake found himself once more at Ms. Evelyn's estate. This time, Mrs. May, the housekeeper, greeted him with a serious look. "Miss Evelyn is waiting for you in the garden," she said, her tone giving nothing away. Following her through the mansion's corridors, Jake soon found himself in a lush garden, the sweet scent of flowers filling the air. Miss Evelyn sat on a stone bench, gazing thoughtfully at a bed of roses. She turned to Jake as he approached and gestured for him to sit. "You did well yesterday, Jake," she began, her voice even. "You showed you're not afraid of hard work. But I need more than strength from a partner. Wealth, you see, brings not only privileges but responsibilities. Sometimes, those responsibilities require judgment and diplomacy." Jake nodded, wondering what challenge lay ahead. "I'm ready to prove myself. Ms. Evelyn, just tell me what you need me to do." A faint smile appeared at the corners of her lips, and she handed him a folded piece of paper. "This is a list of names," she explained. "These people owe me money. Some of these debts are substantial, and they need to be repaid. Today, I want you to go into town, meet these people, and collect what they owe." Jake's heart raced as he glanced at the list. It wasn't a short one, and he recognized many of the names as local merchants and townsfolk he knew well. The thought of confronting them, many of whom had surely faced their own hardships, made him uneasy. Ms. Evelyn noticed his hesitation and raised an eyebrow. "It won't be easy, Jake. Not everyone will be willing to part with their money. But as my partner, you would be expected to handle these affairs with both firmness and tact. Go and do your best. But remember, I need someone I can trust to bring the money back safely." Jake swallowed, nodding. "I understand. Ms. Evelyn, I'll handle it." Leaving the estate, he felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his chest. As he walked down the busy streets, passing familiar faces, he wondered how they'd react to his task. Collecting debts was delicate work, and it was bound to stir up resentment. He was reminded that his goal was a life of security, yet he began to question the price he might pay for it. The first name on his list was Mr. Howard, a fabric merchant whose shop was known for fine textiles. Jake entered the small store, its shelves lined with colorful bolts of cloth, and greeted Mr. Howard, who looked up with a smile. "Jake, what brings you here?" the man asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Jake felt a pang of discomfort, but he kept his voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Howard. Ms. Evelyn has sent me to collect what's owed. Mr. Howard's smile faded, his face clouding over. I see, he muttered, reaching into his cash box and counting out the bills with a reluctant sigh. Tell her this will be the last time I owe her anything. Jake took the money, thanking Mr. Howard, though he sensed the merchant's irritation simmering beneath his polite farewell. As he moved through the list, the reactions were mixed. Some, like Mr. Howard, handed over their payments with quiet resignation, while others offered excuses, pleading for more time. Each encounter chipped away at Jake's initial resolve, leaving him torn between his duty to Ms. Evelyn and his sympathy for the people struggling to make ends meet. One of the more difficult encounters came with Mrs. Thompson, a spice vendor known for her strong will. When Jake approached her and mentioned Ms. Evelyn, her eyes narrowed. Tell Ms. Evelyn I don't have her money, she snapped, her voice sharp. Times are tough, and I'm barely scraping by. Jake felt himself flush with embarrassment, aware of the eyes of other market-goers on him. He tried to reason with her, lowering his voice to avoid attention. Maybe we could arrange for a partial payment. Mrs. Thompson? Ms. Evelyn is fair, and I'm sure she'd appreciate the effort. But Mrs. Thompson crossed her arms stubbornly. No, not a penny until I'm back on my feet. It was clear he wouldn't get anywhere with her today, and he finally nodded, stepping back. Very well, Mrs. Thompson. I'll let Ms. Evelyn know. By late afternoon, Jake had collected a fair amount, though several names on the list had gone unpaid. He felt the weight of the task as he returned to Ms. Evelyn's estate, aware that he'd need to explain why he hadn't been able to collect from everyone. When he arrived, Ms. Evelyn awaited him in her grand sitting room. She examined the money he handed over, her face unreadable, before glancing up at him. Not everyone paid. I see, she remarked, her tone calm but piercing. Jake took a deep breath. I did my best, Ms. Evelyn. Many of them are struggling, and I couldn't force payments from those who genuinely couldn't afford it. For a moment, Ms. Evelyn simply looked at him, her expression inscrutable. Then, with a slight nod, she spoke. You did well, Jake. It's important to balance strength with compassion. In a life of wealth, it's all too easy to forget the struggles of others. Relief washed over Jake, but as he prepared to leave, Ms. Evelyn called him back. Her gaze softened, though her words held a quiet gravity. You must understand, Jake, that a life with me won't simply give you wealth. It will come with responsibilities that may weigh heavily on you. Are you prepared for that? Jake met her gaze, the question lingering in his mind long after he left her estate. He realized then that Ms. Evelyn was testing not only his loyalty, but his character, his capacity to make difficult decisions, and his understanding of what it truly meant to pursue a life of wealth. As he walked home that night, Jake wondered how much of himself he would have to sacrifice to prove his worth, and if, in the end, he would still recognize the man he had become. The following morning, Jake awoke with a sense of anticipation mingled with apprehension. Each test Ms. Evelyn had given him had chipped away at his initial excitement and forced him to confront the weight of his choices. Yet, despite his doubts, he returned to her estate, driven by the allure of the life he'd always imagined. Upon arriving, he was greeted by Mrs. May, who spoke with a tone more serious than usual. Ms. Evelyn is expecting you in her office, she said, gesturing for him to follow. In the quiet of Ms. Evelyn's private office, the woman herself sat surrounded by papers, ledgers, and stacks of documents. Jake could see she was deeply involved in managing her affairs, and he was reminded of the formidable strength she wielded in the community. She looked up, her eyes sharp. Good morning, Jake. Today, I have a different kind of task for you, one that requires loyalty above all else. Jake's heart quickened at her words. He knew the stakes were rising with each challenge. I'm ready, Ms. Evelyn, he replied, hoping his voice sounded steady. Ms. Evelyn studied him for a moment before speaking. I have a business associate named Mr. Rowan. We've been partners for years, but recently, I've come across evidence that suggests he may have been less than honest in our dealings. If he has, it would be a serious betrayal of trust, one I cannot overlook. Jake shifted slightly, sensing where this might be headed. You want me to find out if he's been dishonest? He asked cautiously. Ms. Evelyn nodded. Yes. I need you to visit Mr. Rowan, speak with him, and find out the truth. If he's guilty, I'll need proof. Be careful. Jake, he's a powerful man, and he won't take kindly to accusations. Jake felt the weight of the task settle over him. Investigating someone as influential as Mr. Rowan was a dangerous proposition. One wrong step, and he could find himself at odds with a man who had the resources to make life very difficult. But he couldn't refuse, not after everything he had already invested in this path. Consider it done. Ms. Evelyn, he said, keeping his tone confident. With her instructions fresh in his mind, Jake made his way to Mr. Rowan's estate later that day. The property was grand, a sprawling mansion framed by towering oaks and well-kept gardens. Guards at the gate allowed him through after he explained his purpose. And soon he found himself face to face with the man himself. Mr. Rowan was tall and imposing, with a firm handshake and a booming voice that filled the room. Ah, Jake, I've heard of you. Ms. Evelyn's new protege. I presume, he greeted Jake with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jake forced a polite smile, though he could feel tension in the air. Yes, Mr. Rowan, I've come to discuss some business matters on Ms. Evelyn's behalf. There have been some concerns about recent transactions. Mr. Rowan's smile faded, his gaze sharpening. Concerns, he echoed, crossing his arms as he leaned forward. What kind of concerns? Jake swallowed, keeping his composure. Ms. Evelyn has noticed certain discrepancies in the profits from your joint ventures. She's asked me to gather information to ensure everything is in order. A flicker of something, anger, perhaps, crossed Mr. Rowan's face, though he quickly masked it with a tight smile. So, she suspects me of dishonesty? He asked, his tone dangerous. Jake knew he was treading on thin ice. No accusations. Mr. Rowan, I'm only here to clarify matters. For a moment, Mr. Rowan's expression hardened, and Jake felt his pulse quicken. Then, with a slow nod, Mr. Rowan turned and opened a drawer in his desk, pulling out a stack of documents. Here, he said, handing them over. Take these back to Ms. Evelyn and tell her everything is as it should be. I don't appreciate being questioned, but I'll humor her this time. Jake took the documents, relief flooding him. He thanked Mr. Rowan and made his way out, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly avoided something dangerous. The man's gaze had been cold, and his parting words had felt more like a warning than a farewell. As he walked back to Ms. Evelyn's estate, Jake examined the documents. They appeared to be in order, but something didn't sit right with him. He felt as though Mr. Rowan had given him only what he wanted him to see, as if there was something hidden beneath the surface. When he returned to Ms. Evelyn, he handed her the documents, watching as she flipped through them, her expression inscrutable. What do you think? Jake, she asked after a moment, her gaze steady on him. Jake hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Rowan gave me the documents, but I'm not sure we can trust him. I sensed he was hiding something, but I couldn't say what. Ms. Evelyn closed the file, a faint smile touching her lips. Good. Trust your instincts. Jake, in a life of wealth, people are not always as they seem. Loyalty is rare, and betrayal can come from those closest to you. Jake felt a mix of relief and pride. He had passed another test, yet the experience had left him unsettled. He had come face to face with the darker side of ambition and power, where alliances were fragile, and loyalty was often a matter of convenience. As he prepared to leave, Ms. Evelyn's parting words lingered in his mind. Remember, Jake, loyalty isn't something to take lightly. In my world, those who betray are often betrayed in return. It's a game that can consume you if you're not careful. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he wondered just how far he was willing to go. Each task had brought him closer to Ms. Evelyn's world, yet it had also revealed shadows he hadn't anticipated. For every promise of wealth and power, there seemed to be an equal cost, one that demanded parts of himself he wasn't sure he could give. As dawn broke the next morning, Jake felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He could sense that he was reaching a turning point. Yet his commitment to the life Miss Evelyn had shown him hadn't faltered. Each test had peeled away his assumptions, leaving him with more questions than answers. But now, he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. When he arrived at Ms. Evelyn's estate that morning, the atmosphere felt different. The usually lively grounds were quiet, and Mrs. May greeted him with a somber look. "Ms. Evelyn is waiting for you in the main hall," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Jake made his way inside, where he found Ms. Evelyn standing by a long, polished table, her gaze fixed on a small wooden box resting at its center. Her expression was unreadable, a blend of authority and intensity that made Jake's pulse quicken. "Jake," she began, her voice steady and calm. "Today, I'm giving you a final test. This one will determine your future, not only with me, but within the world of wealth and influence that you've sought." Jake's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the box. He knew that whatever was inside represented the culmination of everything he'd worked toward. "I'm ready, Ms. Evelyn," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Evelyn placed a hand on the box, her gaze meeting his. "Inside this box is a contract, a document that will ruin Mr. Rowan if it is signed and executed. You were right about him. He betrayed me, and now I need someone to help me end his influence. By signing this contract, you'll ensure that I rise above him, that our partnership grows stronger. But you'll also be responsible for the ruin of a man's life. Once you sign, there's no turning back. You'll be fully committed to this life." Jake stared at the box, the gravity of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing against his chest, demanding an answer that would shape the rest of his life. The promise of wealth and power lay just within his grasp. But the price, to actively ruin someone else for his own gain, was one he hadn't expected to face so directly. For a long moment, the room was silent. Jake's mind raced, caught between the life he had dreamed of and the cost he would have to pay. He thought of the people he knew who had struggled and sacrificed for the things they valued. He thought of Ms. Evelyn, who had shown him a world of power and influence, but at a cost that was becoming harder to justify. Finally, Jake found his voice. "Ms. Evelyn," he began, steadying himself, "I've learned so much from you. You've shown me the power of wealth, the influence it brings, and the way it can shape the lives of others. But I've also learned something more important. Some things are more valuable than wealth, and I'm not sure I'm willing to give them up, even for all of this." Ms. Evelyn's expression softened, though her gaze remained unwavering. "And what are those things?" "Jake!" He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his choice crystallize within him. "Integrity, compassion, the ability to look myself in the mirror without regret. I can't sign that contract. Ms. Evelyn, I can't destroy another man's life just to secure my own. If I have to lose everything to keep my conscience intact, then that's a price I'm willing to pay." For a moment, Ms. Evelyn said nothing. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to cut through the air. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, one that was both approving and filled with a hint of admiration. "You've made your choice," she said softly, her voice filled with an unexpected warmth. "And it's a brave one. Many men would have signed that contract without a second thought. But you didn't. That tells me that you're stronger than I thought." Jake blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected her to react this way. "So, this was a test?" Ms. Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, this entire journey has been about testing your character, not your loyalty alone. I needed to see if you valued something beyond riches. True strength, Jake, isn't about amassing wealth. It's about staying true to yourself when temptation calls." Jake felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. He hadn't lost himself, after all, but he also knew that his decision meant he would no longer have a place in Ms. Evelyn's world. "I understand if this means I can't be by your side anymore," he said, his voice steady. Ms. Evelyn smiled, a look of genuine respect in her eyes. "You're right. This life isn't for you, Jake, but that doesn't mean you've failed. In fact, you've succeeded in the most important way. You've held on to who you are, And that's something far more valuable than any wealth I could offer. Jake nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle within him. He had made the right choice, and though it meant leaving behind the comforts he'd longed for, he knew that he was ready to face whatever lay ahead on his own terms. As he left Ms. Evelyn's mansion for the last time, he realized that his journey wasn't truly over. He would go forward without the riches, but with something far more precious, his integrity. And though he hadn't gained the life of luxury he'd once imagined, he knew he'd gained something far more lasting. That night, as he looked up at the stars, he felt a quiet contentment. Wealth, he realized, was not measured in money alone. True wealth came from within, from the strength to stand by one's values, no matter the cost. Thank you for joining us on Jake's journey through ambition, loyalty, and self-discovery. His story reminds us that while wealth and power can be tempting, staying true to our values is what defines real strength. We hope you found inspiration in Jake's choices and the lessons he uncovered along the way. If you enjoyed this story and the insights it offered, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales. Until next time, remember, true wealth comes from within,